welcome to From Awareness to Action, Confronting Physical Disability Bias in the Legal Profession. I'm Anthony Ross. I'm a partner at the Lewis Brisbois Law Firm here in Los Angeles and chair of the Beverly Hills Bar Association's Inclusion Section. I'm delighted to introduce today's speakers, Brandy Salave, David Cross, and AJ Link. Brandy Salave is the legal director of Independent Living Resource Center of San Francisco, where she supervises their legal services program. Her experience includes Social Security benefit matters, requests for reasonable accommodations, pre-eviction matters, immigration matters, and criminal and post-conviction relief. Brandy is passionate about advocating for underserved and marginalized individuals and educating people about their rights. David Cross is a partner in Goodvin's antitrust and competition practice and a member of the firm's complex litigation and dispute resolution practice. He is a leading first-chair trial lawyer with extensive experience representing both plaintiffs and defendants in antitrust and complex business litigation, including intellectual property and general commercial matters. David also maintains a strong pro bono practice focused on civil rights work. And AJ Link will be moderating today's program, and he is the founding president of the National Disabled Law Students Association and the National Disabled Legal Professionals Association. AJ is openly autistic and works as a policy analyst for the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. He is the inaugural director of the Center for Air and Space Law Task Force on Inclusion, Diversity, and Equity in Aerospace, and is an adjunct professor of space law at Howard University School of Law. AJ serves as a research director for the Just Add Astro Project, the accessibility team lead for Astro Access, the space law and policy chair for Black in Astro. And now let's get started. I hand it over to AJ.
Thank you so much, Tony. Really appreciate that. Thank you all so much for being here with us. This is AJ Link speaking. I am a Black dude with a beard. I'm currently wearing a green Tampa Bay Lightning hat with a green shirt, and there is a gallery wall behind me. Before we get into the questions today, though, I wanted to give Brandy an opportunity to level set and give us kind of an introduction to some of the vocabulary we're going to be using today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, AJ. So for the most part, these definitions have come from my wife, who is a disability retired civil rights attorney, Sandra Salave, from a talk that she did a few years ago. So first I wanted to talk about ableism a little bit. What is ableism? Ableism includes beliefs, prejudice, or actual discrimination against people who are disabled or who are perceived to be disabled, even if they are not. Many times we are aware of our prejudice. For example, like an old-fashioned example would be hiring a male attorney because we assume that he will be more aggressive. That's an example of an explicit prejudice or belief that's different from an implicit bias. With implicit bias, we are not quite aware of our own beliefs or prejudice. We may really think we do not have prejudice. We may think we fully believe that all people are equal, but may interpret the world around us accordingly to these underlying beliefs. For example, in a healthcare situation, we may assume men in scrubs are doctors and women in scrubs are nurses. Or take my wife, for example. She had an appointment to meet with a doctor to see if he would be a good expert witness for a case that she was trying. But because she was fat, he assumed that she was there to be a patient asking for his help. It did not occur to him that a lawyer he was meeting with would be a higher weight person. So let's talk about myth or truth for a second. People who are trying to do the right thing do not engage in ableism. Myth. Most of us are trying to do the right thing, and most of us, in some way, at some point, will engage in some form of ableism. We're living in a culture that is saturated with ableism, and even more importantly, ableism is not just about someone's intent. It is about the impact of what we do. We may not mean for it to happen, but it still will cause harm. Ableism exists because of the widespread dangerous assumptions that lives of people with disabilities are less valuable than lives of non-disabled people. Let's use COVID as an example. COVID has been a turning point for disabled communities. Part of what made this happen is because disabled people have been asking and begging for remote accommodations at work or even in recreational activities for years. But we have been denied because many disabled people, and this would cause many disabled people to lose their jobs or to lead very much more isolated and dependent lives than they should have to. The response we got as disabled people was usually that these accommodations were too complicated or could not be done. But then suddenly COVID happened. Everyone, meaning non-disabled folks as well, benefited from remote access. Many workplaces became remote. Many recreational activities became accessible for the first time. Next, we should talk about intersectionality. Professor Kimberly Crenshaw created this term, intersectionality, more than 30 years ago. And it may be even more important now. She explained the term in a Time magazine interview. As we hear her words, consider how they apply to disabled people of color. Intersectionality is basically a lens, a prism for seeing the way in which various forms of inequality often operate together and exasperate each other. We tend to talk about race inequality as separate from inequality based on gender, class, sexuality, or immigration status. What's often missing is how some people are subject to all of these. And the experience is not just the sum of its parts. Intersectionality is simply how certain aspects of who you are will increase your access to the good things or your exposure to the bad things in life. There is no single disabled experience. There are many different types of disabilities. And so there are many different types of experiences for being disabled. That will become clear as we share some of our personal stories today. Types of disabilities. So there's lots, as I say, there's lots of types of disabilities. Lots of times we think of disability and we picture a person using a wheelchair, or maybe a deaf person, or maybe a person like me who is blind. But disabilities can also impact the way people communicate, move, look, feel, think, act, understand the world, and how they take in information. Some types of disabilities are more stigmatized than others, or definitely stigmatized. Some people have more than one disability. There are also a lot of different ways that we become disabled. Some people are born disabled, as I was. Some people become progressively disabled as they age. Some people may be a victim of a crime or an accident. Each different experience impacts how a person learns about and deals with their disability. With that in mind, let's turn to some more personal questions about our experiences and being disabled and practicing law. I will turn it back to AJ.
Thank you so much, Brandy, for providing that grounding as we get into these questions. If it's okay with you, I'll ask the first question to David so he has an opportunity to join us in terms of speaking. But
Definitely.
the first question is, can you share more about your journey to get to where you are today? I mean, all of us are here talking about ableism in the legal profession. So can you talk about what you had to do to get here and how ableism and systemic barriers impacted you along your journey? So David, please.
Sure. Thanks, AJ. And Brandy, thanks for the setup for the conversation. That was very helpful. And hopefully the dogs don't make too much noise in the background during our discussion today. Yeah, I guess the way I would answer that question, AJ, is both sort of positive and negative, I think, is the way I sort of think about the experience, having been born with a disability, born without a left hand. The there have been hurdles to get over during the course of, my journey and my career, both beginning as a kid and through education. And then ultimately, there are also ways that I think my circumstances and my disability have actually helped me in a lot of ways. And so, for me, it's been a journey of ups and downs. That the ups for me are, I think those of us who are either born with disabilities or develop disabilities later in life, there are unique challenges that come with that. And that drives, I think, certain levels of persistence and creativity. For example, in my practice, it is incredibly important to be creative. I think one of the ways that I try to set myself apart from my clients is coming up with creative solutions to the problems they face. And I spent my life doing that, since the age of, I think I was 4 or 5 when I first learned how to tie my shoes and devised a way to do that on my own. And my parents thought I'd probably wear Velcro shoes the rest of my life. And so there are sort of these positive attributes that have come from the journey. Ableism has come up along the way. Unfortunately, as Brandy said, it's, I think, a sort of systemic part of the world in which we live. I think in fairness, oftentimes it comes up in implicit ways and unconscious ways, ways that people aren't aware that they're even doing in the moment. Some of those can be minor, some of those can be major. The sort of more minor ways that I've confronted it are, there are a lot of folks that I've dealt with over the years that I've worked with, whether as colleagues, folks across the aisle, different aspects of the profession, who can't have a conversation with me without, staring every few seconds down at my missing hand, at my left arm. It's minor in the sense that it doesn't keep me from doing my job, but it's significant in the sense that it is a constant reminder in these conversations and these interactions that these people see me as something different, and they're distracted, right, from a conversation that I'm trying to have and something that's important. They can't even really focus on that. It's come up in more major ways where I can recall relatively early in my career where we were going to pitch something, a new matter. And the partner on it who had the relationship said that they thought it was better that I didn't join the pitch because the client might be uncomfortable hiring someone with a physical disability. Instead, they would try to win the pitch, bring it in, and then they would staff me on it after. That was certainly a really disappointing thing to hear, and to be able to have to sit on the sidelines of that opportunity. So ultimately, I feel like I've developed a successful practice and a successful career, and I'm happy with where I am. But it has certainly been a journey with a lot of ups and downs.
Thank you so much for sharing that, David. If it's okay with you, I'd love to learn more about your experience navigating education, both, primary education, collegiate education, law school, as someone with a very apparent disability. I know that in law school, for me, the ability to be open and communicative about being disabled and experiencing law school as a student with disability was still kind of taboo. And that's for someone with a non-apparent disability. So I would be interested to know what your experience was like, how that impacted your ability to kind of navigate school, taking the bar, those kinds of things.
Yeah, my experience, I think, was similar to yours, AJ. I think one of the things that we've made progress on in the last, I've been practicing now for almost 25 years. I think one of the things we've made progress on is that there's more dialogue around this. The fact that we're having this conversation, and I've done other panels for the ABA, for example, on this topic. I think that's good progress that has sort of less of a stigma around disabilities than there once was. I think there's still a pretty strong negative stigma that people have, again, whether conscious or unconscious. And so the way I navigated it, to be honest with you, was I didn't really address it. I have my disability is such that I can hide it at least for a while by just literally putting my arm in my pocket. And I went through most of my life in that way. To give you an example, when I would interview at law firms during law school, anyone who's been through it obviously remembers the grueling way that it used to be, at least, where you would show up at a hotel for 2 or 3 straight days. And at least my experience was that, and you met with a whole bunch of different folks. I would go into every one of those interviews with my hands in my pockets and really try to consciously not take my left arm out of my pocket so they didn't notice. because my fear was if they did, it would certainly impact how they viewed me. It'd become a distraction, and whether it was conscious or unconscious, it would limit my opportunities. And I've had points in my career where I've known people for months before they realized that I was missing a left hand because I was so successful at hiding it. And I would say I didn't even really become comfortable talking about it until several years ago, really during the COVID pandemic. I think a lot of us had time to kind of, things slowed down for a while in the world and we had time to reflect. And this was one of the things I reflected on and realized I didn't think I was doing myself a good service. I thought I was doing the broader community a disservice in approaching that way, and feeling like it was something I always needed to hide and can talk about, and trying to avoid the stigma that I think still exists unfairly, rather than confronting it head on. And I think the only way to really deal with it is to educate people, get people more comfortable with it, help people understand the little things that they're doing that they're probably not aware of that create challenges and create discomfort, and the bigger things that they're doing sometimes that are overt that can create real hurdles to success for individuals with disabilities.
Thank you, David. I think you touched on a point, and I'd love to come to Brandy with this, because Brandy, I think your experience is a bit different than David's in that. David, I'm sure you experienced a lot of extra mental burden thinking about how am I moving through the world so that people do not look at my left hand, right? And that's a lot of extra mental effort that I'm sure you didn't really think about, but once you stop doing that, you realize there's so much more room to think about things, to address things, to be focused and present for the conversation. Where Brandy, sometimes that's not necessarily what your experience would be, right? It's not like you can put your eyes in your pocket for the day or something like that. So what was your experience and your journey like in dealing with ableism, systemic barriers?
Yeah, so I graduated from law school in 2009. That was a terrible time in the job market in general. And I went on several interviews, and I think, I had experiences of people maybe knowing that I don't typically walk with a cane. I used to, but not anymore. And I don't know if people always could tell that I had a visual impairment. Certainly if I, am reading something in front of them, they would tell. Maybe they might say like, oh, her one eye is looking different, a different direction or something like that. But in the beginning of looking for a legal job, I would actually tell people that I was legally blind, and would basically say, like, it's not a problem, like I can still get to work if I need to get to court or whatever, it's not a problem. But I can tell you for sure that there was one particular like family law, huge corporate family law firm that I interviewed with that definitely did not hire me, and their attitudes totally changed as soon as they found out that I was visually impaired and couldn't like drive. So after that experience, I actually stopped telling employers or potential employers that I had a visual disability until I was hired. So I eventually was hired for a position at a private practice, a smaller private practice, and didn't tell the hiring attorney that I couldn't drive or had a visual impairment until after I was hired. And that seemed to work for me. I mean, that's often sometimes the advice I give clients that, need some sort of accommodation or service animal or something like that, and for an apartment or what have you. It's better to ask for the accommodation later if you need one. That worked for me. After I worked at that firm, I was able to gain experience. I was as a new attorney, and when looking for future employment, I applied for other positions and did sometimes disclose my disability and was still hired. But in 2009, that was not the case. And I also want to take a moment to bring it back a little bit to the intersectionality part of things that I was talking about, earlier, because I am disabled, but also I'm fat, I'm part of the LGBTQ community, and sometimes discrimination, it's not just sometimes people can say, okay, I can work with a lesbian, or I can work with a fat person, or I can work with a disabled person. But when you have all three of those things in one person, that can also be a stretch for people sometimes. And I just want to point out, you may notice I'm using the word fat. I am in fat community and have a kind of a side pro bono part of a law office called Fat Legal Advocacy Rights and Education Project. And so that word is just a descripting word for us, just as short and tall, maybe, but another word you could use would be higher weight. And, people shouldn't face discrimination based on their size or their disability or any characteristics or any combination of those characteristics. And within the disabled community, itself, there's sort of sometimes prejudiced against some people that are people of different size, or against people, race or other characteristics, just like there is in non-disabled community. All these things go hand in hand. And as far as the law school, question and my experience there, I grew up until I was in third grade going to special ed classes and having large print books, which one textbook would be about 8 large print books. And so by the time I got to law school, it's not that I was trying to hide anything, but it was that I just wanted to use the regular size materials because it was much easier to carry, one book instead of 8 or whatever the case may be. And so I would, read materials close, or I would sit in the front of the classroom so that I could see things better. People definitely did know that I was disabled. Interestingly enough, in my law school, even though I did have, accommodations like extra time for tests or things like that, I only actually had one professor that made my materials larger print for me, which was very helpful. But and would bring them to class, which was great because I wasn't then carrying them all around. But it's just interesting that, like, out of, a large school, one professor, my entire time, my entire law school career, was the only person that did that. So that's just an interesting thing to note.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that as someone who hated taking my textbooks home. I would try to do all my reading on campus so I wouldn't have to lug materials back and forth. I totally understand not wanting to have all the extra, the books and reading materials. But Brandy, something you were talking about reminded me of something, David, you talked about with your experience of not being able to pitch. And I know we talked about implicit bias, and Brandy, you were talking about how people will view a person who maybe has various differences from what's quote unquote normal and judge them on that. And I'm wondering how each of you feels about, the term implicit bias, but how it turns to almost actionable discrimination, right? Like, the idea that you are not competent as an attorney based on how you look, not how you practice, how you prepare your materials, how you prepare for a case, whatever, but quite simply how you look. That implicit bias becomes active, right? It becomes active discrimination, saying you are not competent to do your job, even though you've gone to school, you've passed the bar, you're in good standing with whatever bar association or jurisdiction you're in. So I'd love to, I don't know, just have a chat with y'all about how oftentimes I think we excuse ableism as implicit bias when really there is active, harmful discrimination that comes from that. And we can go to David first.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. I mean, one of the implicit bias, I think you've captured really well, right? On the one hand, it's not intended, and so it's not insidious in that way of where you've got someone who is being overtly bigoted in some way. But the consequence can be equally damaging, right? Exactly as you say, AJ, because once you have the implicit bias and it manifests in some way, there is going to be some adverse consequence that comes from that. And we see that a lot. One of the things that I think we struggle with in the profession, in particular, is the impact of implicit bias on advancement and on positions of influence in law firms. And so, and I would say even in getting in the door, I think at the stage of hiring, when you look at the statistical number of individuals coming out of law schools who have disabilities, whether visible or otherwise, it is necessarily a substantial number of those folks. When you look at the number of folks who identify as disabled within the legal community, and particularly in larger law firms like mine, it is a very, very small, really sort of a trivial number. I don't think that happens by accident. And I think that, the same is true as you look over time for other disadvantaged communities. Brandy's talked about some, right? The gay and the LGBTQ plus community, certainly racial communities, and, maybe confess my own bias. I think we as a profession have done better with some communities than we have with others, which is not to say that we don't have a long ways to go. I think we still have a long ways to go with a lot of folks that are still disadvantaged disproportionately and unfairly today. But I often think of those of us with disabilities as sort of the somewhat forgotten community that just has not gotten the same focus over the last 20 to 30 years. And I will confess, I think part of that is I think we're not as organized as a community. I think we're often not as vocal as a community. And I myself am the perfect example. It was something I really didn't want to talk about for the last, first 20 years of my career because I was so concerned about the stigma. And it often reminds me of, when I started my career, at that point, the LGBTQ plus community had not made the strides that had been made over the last 25 years. And I can remember friends early in their career who, face the difficult decision of, do they identify as gay or lesbian in the workplace? Because they were very worried about the stigma at that time, what that might mean for their work opportunities. I think we've come a long ways, still have a long ways to go. But today, with disabilities, the folks that I hear from, the folks I talk to, both at prior firms and beyond, I've had a lot of folks reach out to me, particularly as I've gotten more vocal on this from lots of other law firms, have coffee and Zoom calls, a lot of folks. One thing that comes across with every single one of them is they are very, very nervous about identifying as disabled. And if they can hide it, they're going to hide it. And I think it just creates such an unhealthy environment. As you pointed out, AJ, there is sort of this additional kind of mental burden that comes along when you're trying to do that. But there's also just the stress that comes with that and sort of negative self-images that come along with that, where it's this sort of reinforcing kind of toxic mentality that's I have to hide something that's a core component of who I am, who affects who I am, because others may have a negative reaction to that, whether it's implicit or not. And to your point, AJ, even implicit bias, once that negative reaction manifests, it is very much real discrimination in the workplace. So I think you hit the nail on the head. It's a good point to emphasize, and I don't quite have a solution for it other than having these types of conversations, and hopefully people listen and learn, and we all do better.
Yeah, and Brandy, I want to come to you. I think, David, you brought up a really good point of how, because as part of the National Disabled Legal Professionals Association, I keep up with these numbers a little bit, but there's such a huge gap between the number of students who volunteer that they're disabled versus the number of students who are actually getting accommodations versus the number of students who applied to the law school and said they were disabled versus changing that once they're accepted for fear that they won't get accepted. Versus students who ask for accommodations on the LSAT to get into law school compared to law school graduates that ask for accommodations on the bar exams, refusing to grant accommodations for whatever reason. And then to your point, people who are openly volunteering as disabled, as practitioners, but then moving up, as partners and things like that. All of these numbers are very disparate. It's not like one is 10% and one is 14%. It's like, oh, there's a gap or understandable. The numbers are all over the place, right? I think the number of openly identified disabled partners in the legal profession is something like under 3%, maybe even lower than that. Whereas the last numbers that I saw for privately identifying law students, and even then people have the stigma, is close to 15% of law students identify as having a disability privately, right? So like that's a huge gap, right? Brandy, I'd love your input on why you think there's still that stigma the gap in numbers, how the implicit bias and discrimination plays a role. David kind of mentioned that internalized ableism that people have that are impacting their ability to be their full selves in the workplace. I think I'm just rambling about all the factors, but I'd love to hear your thoughts about why there's such that big gap between people who are comfortable identifying as disabled legal professionals.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's interesting. I think that, it goes back to sort of what I was saying before about, me choosing not to tell one of my first employers that I finally got hired at that, not to tell them about my disability, because I wasn't being hired as someone saying that they had a disability, and I had the experience that was needed, for the job posting. So I do think that's interesting. I think that, as David said, I agree that also we also have our own internalized ableism. I mean, I'm sure I didn't want to carry large books for law school, but, I also wanted to read the books that everybody else was reading, or, we all have our own internalized ableism as well. And it probably does make it so we just want to, not mention it or pretend it's not there. But I think the more that we do mention it, or that we are, just seen as disabled, and the more times you are passed up for the job promotion, or you're passed up for getting the job, the more you're going to decide not to share that anymore. I think my experience is a little bit different because, as I mentioned earlier, all disabilities are different. And so all people's experiences are different. And, me being blind, I think that's sort of seen as like a good disability in disability community. Um, and so for me specifically, I think the stigma of being blind is probably less than it is in some cases for some other disabilities. And I've actually found that in some situations, it's actually helped me in some ways. I think it makes me a little bit more memorable. So I've actually had really great relationships with judges or opposing counsel that knew. Um, and I think that in some ways, it sort of humanizes me. It would humanize my client in some cases. And in some cases, when I didn't feel like it would help the situation, or I didn't want opposing counsel to know, then I didn't mention it. Oftentimes, I'd communicate with, trying to negotiate settlements or whatever via phone. Oftentimes, opposing counsel wouldn't realize. And yeah, I wasn't going to volunteer it if I thought that it would, not benefit my client in some way. Um, the interesting thing is I've actually been discriminated against based on being a woman from a client. I had a client once, I was representing um her son actually in a juvenile matter, and she wanted the other partner of the firm to be the person that would actually go to court with her son, not me, even though I was the one working on all the case and knowing all the details, because she thought the female judge would listen to a man more than another woman. So, it's interesting, like we're here today talking about implicit bias and disability, but she had a very explicit prejudice towards women. So yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, and one thing I would add on that topic, AJ, picking up on a point that Brandon was making, is I do think there is sort of a spectrum of disabilities in terms of how it affects people's reactions and the biases and the hurdles that come up. And I think what it comes back to is, do folks who are in decision-making positions, whether it's over hiring, advancement, some sort of influence over a lawyer's career, do they feel like at some level, whether conscious or unconscious, that the disability is going to affect them and make their lives harder in some way? And I think that is a challenge that we face. Fortunately for me, I don't think anybody thinks my disability makes their lives harder. There are other disabilities that I think they do think that. And, I can remember sitting at a table with a bunch of lawyers once who were complaining after COVID about an associate at a firm who had long haul COVID. And the consequence was this person would get these bouts of exhaustion that came out of nowhere, and they would have to just go and rest, take a nap for an hour. And the lawyers who were talking about it were complaining and sort of bemoaning how this made their lives harder because they didn't know if this person might disappear for an hour. I mean, it struck me as not something that would be that hard to manage as a supervising partner. But they were really unhappy with it. And the conversation quickly became, well, we should steer work to someone else because then we don't have to deal with this. And, there is some level where I kind of get that instinct that as lawyers, our lives are difficult and stressful to begin with. We want things to be simple and we want to work with people who make our lives simple. In fact, it's often what we will tell junior lawyers, right? The best way to be successful is to make yourself an asset to make things easier for the people who are relying on you. But at some point, I think we also have to be human beings. We have to be empathetic and compassionate and recognize that people have challenges that manifest in all manner of different ways. That one person had one particular challenge that created a disability for them that I think probably had a pretty trivial impact on the people relying on that person. And in my mind, that certainly wasn't the way to deal with it. And the last point I'll make is it really struck me that I was sitting at this table with all these lawyers complaining about this, and it never once entered their mind that it might be offensive to someone else who was sitting there with a disability, which again gets to the implicit bias, which is I think it's so unconscious with some folks that in their mind, they think they're just having a normal conversation about someone who's created some challenge for them, and they're talking about how they're going to navigate that. And it never enters their mind that one, the conversation is unfair in the way that they're thinking about it and talking about it, and the action plan that they have in mind, which is to take work away from this person, which ultimately will limit that person's career opportunities. And then also not thinking about the person who's sitting at the table with disability and how it might be insulting in the way that they're having this conversation. And all really good people. I know those people well. They're genuinely good people. And I think if I had said something to them about it and I decided in the moment not to, because it was just a context in which I didn't think it was going to be the right time to bring that up, I think they would have felt really bad. But the reality is that they go through their lives making those types of decisions and having those conversations all the time. And folks with disabilities pay the price for it. And so again, it comes back to the point I made before. We've got to educate people. We've got to enlighten people on how they're thinking about these things, how it's impacting them, and then ultimately how it's impacting others.
Yeah, I agree. I agree, David. AJ, is it okay if I go off of that for a second?
Yeah, please feel free.
I think trainings like what David was saying and talking about, and trainings like this one are super helpful. And I also think making sure like the environment for people is accessible. Like if you think back to law school and the attached desks and chairs, like those chairs do not work for everyone. They don't work for a lot of people. And so you're automatically excluding and telling disabled people that there's not room for them there. There's not room for them in their own like legal classroom. So trying to make, places that have like work environments accessible will actually make the life of everyone easier in the end. So not having conference rooms that you have to go upstairs to get to without having an elevator, or having different types of seating in like waiting rooms that can be chairs with arms, chairs with no arms, couches, chairs that have higher weight capacities, or having conference rooms that have room for a wheelchair to go through without everybody having to like move their chairs. Like if you have the environment set up so it's accessible for everyone, that will automatically make it easier for everyone, accessible for everyone. And it should just be thought about at the beginning, at the planning stage, so that a disabled person doesn't have to come and ask for that. So it's just already there. If our environment's changed, that would be, very helpful.
Yeah, and I would just say, those fixes can be so easy sometimes. I mean, one of my favorite stories is there's a famous story about Mr. Rogers from many years ago. For those who watch Mr. Rogers, he would often begin his show feeding a fish. And he would just walk in and he would talk about what he was talking about that day and feed the fish and not say anything about it. And occasionally he would mention feeding the fish. There was a little blind girl that watched the show. And on the days when he didn't mention that he was feeding the fish, she'd be very concerned that the fish was not getting fed. And so she sent him a letter. And he apparently, the letter made it to him. He read it. He was very troubled that he had upset this young girl. And so from that point forward, on every episode, he would make sure to talk about feeding the fish. And so it was just the smallest little thing, right, where he just added literally seconds to his dialogue that he ensured was there every day. So people who were blind, children who were blind, would know fish got fed. And he, internalized it in other ways so that he could be more descriptive on what he was doing. And so, much as you introduced yourself, AJ, the way you did at the start of the panel today. And so there's very simple little things that might take just seconds of thought and energy that we can do that make the environment more conducive to success for folks who have these disabilities. And the more we do that, we also send a message that we are supportive. And the more we send a message we're supportive, the more people feel comfortable being who they are, being open about themselves. If they need help, asking for help because they're not worried about the negative consequences of that. That ultimately makes them more successful. It makes the enterprise more successful. And so everybody benefits from it if we can figure out the right way to do it.
Yeah, I really fully agree with that and embrace the principles of universal design Brandy was talking about. David, I'm thinking about the anecdote that you gave and how oftentimes people without the disability are concerned about the disabled worker's ability to do the work without realizing, and you talked about this at the beginning, David, that disabled people have already thought about the creative solutions that they need in order to practice and to not be deemed as inferior or bad colleagues or things like that. And I don't know, that anecdote just really got me thinking, like lawyers have a lot of hours in their day. And oftentimes they have to be creative with planning those hours. And to your point, I think taking an hour to rest, which all of us do, it may not be rest because of COVID or long COVID or things like that, but every legal professional does take an hour, however they do it, whatever they do, because they have extended days and that's just how it is. And they have families and things like that, but we find that hour. And I think to your point about implicit bias, people don't think about how oftentimes disabled folks are living their lives and practicing just like other people do. It's just the situation is different. The scheduling is different. The way they go about the day is different, but the actual work is the same. And I think, panels like this, where we've kind of merged two questions, which was specific instances where you've experienced ableism and tips. Brandy gave a nice list of tips. But I think being able to educate people about how, disabled people are more than competent to be attorneys. You're often, and again, David, to your example, surrounded by people, whether or not they're disabled or view them as disabled, you are surrounded by disabled colleagues who are quite good at their jobs. And I think it's really important that we can continue to communicate that. So we have 17 minutes. I want to leave time for audience questions if there are any. We've already combined the specific instances of ableism while practicing. I don't know if either of you want to talk more about that, whether it's from clients, judges, opposing counsel, or court staff. But then I also want to move more into the suggestions. I know Brandon gave a great list, but if there were suggestions for the legal community that can make the profession more accessible and less hostile to disabled practitioners, and what role do organizations like the Beverly Hills Bar Association play in advocating for the disabled members, especially when, again, to use David's example, because it's so visceral, they're probably not in the room knowing that they're being discriminated against. How can we educate folks and not put that burden on the disabled practitioners? So I know that was a lot of rambling from me, but Brandy, if you want to answer any of that or just go off on your own.
Yeah, I think doing trainings like this one, as David had said earlier, I think try to set everyone up for success. If an if an employee tells you that they need a certain accommodation, for example, if an employee says like they need a desk in a quiet corner, try to make that work out for them without trying to like, make it a big deal. Um, and be generous when a disabled person points out like an access problem, not defensive, because the disabled person is not trying to like make your life more difficult. They're actually trying to help and improve things. So I think, you know, just listening to people, coming with an open mind, knowing that you know that access is important for everyone, for all of us, and just yeah, basically do the right thing, and try to give accommodations when they're reasonable, and things of that nature. That's what I would say for the legal community. And then obviously like these types of trainings and the anti-bias trainings and all of that stuff is so important, so that this is in conversation, so that people are thinking about it more, because yeah, it definitely doesn't help like if we're not talking about this stuff and if it's not on folks' minds.
Yeah, I would pick up on the point that Brandy was making about sort of if somebody has some sort of request, if they need help, not getting defensive. One of the things I have heard from a lot of folks over the last several years, as I've spoken on this and people have reached out to talk about their experiences, is a sort of running theme is that folks reached out internal to their firms and didn't really get the receptivity that they had hoped for. And sometimes those asks are fairly small. And my sense is it's not that folks are trying to be difficult in responding. There is my sense of having worked professionally for a long time now is that folks in HR often just don't like to make exceptions. And there are lots of good reasons for that, because when you make one exception, it creates the concern, well, now we've done this, and now other people are going to ask for something else, and then they're going to ask for something else. And so I understand the logic behind it. But the reality is that you have folks who need exceptions, folks with disabilities in particular. And so being more empathetic, and I think more understanding and more accommodating is really important. And also doing it in a way that doesn't require people to share, deeply personal information that they may not want to have to share. Because, one of the reasons folks often will not ask for accommodations is not just the negative stigma that they're worried about, but they're also worried they're going to get lots of questions on, well, why do you need this? And they may not want to explain in detail about why they need this. And they shouldn't have to explain in detail why they need this. And so I think, part of it is sort of making sure the folks who are making these decisions, whether it's in HR or more broadly, supervisors, have the requisite training so that they're sensitive to it. They understand when requests come in, how to handle it, how to be supportive, how to ask questions in the right ways, and not to take things too far. I think that's critically important. Another thing I would say is decision makers. And it gets back to the point I was making earlier. I think we as a profession, I don't think it's unique to our profession. I think it's probably true of just about every industry that exists today. We do not have a lot of leaders with disabilities. We certainly don't have a lot of leaders with physical disabilities or visible disabilities. And I think that's a real problem, right? I mean, we have accepted for a long time, because the studies show that it's true, that when you have a group of folks who are making decisions affecting the lives of others, particularly within a business environment, you want that group to have a level of diversity that sort of reflects the people that they are responsible for, so that they really understand the lives and the journey and the challenges of the people that they're responsible for. And so, I think generally we probably would not accept that if you had if you were to appoint a board of a dozen people and it was everybody on it was the exact same gender, race, and sexuality, I think we'd probably look at that and think, that seems kind of odd. Are they really going to have a deep understanding of lots of people who are not reflected there? But the reality is, if you look at leadership positions across the legal profession, particularly large law firms, mid-sized firms and others, there are not a lot of us with disabilities. And I think that really has an impact on decisions get made in terms of how we think about hiring and promotion and down to the level of training. And if you don't have the right people that are thinking about these issues, and they're not doing maybe as much as they need to do on training people internally, which then has a negative repercussion, and then it becomes this cycle that becomes impossible to break until you get people in a position of influence and authority that they can break that cycle. And I think we've still got a ways to go to do that, unfortunately. And so that's one of the things that I try to emphasize is look around the room at who's making decisions and make sure that those people are a group that really deeply across the group understands what life is like for the people that they're responsible for.
Yeah, I totally agree with what you're saying, David. And I think to sort of go off of that too, to center disabled people and plan for access for disabled people from the beginning of whatever project, like including disabled people for access rather than like seeing it as extra is important. Access is part of basically the cost of doing business. And when you truly realize that disabled people are as valuable as non-disabled people, and you realize that, building stairs instead of a ramp or building a classroom that has fixed seating is a problem with the design, not a problem with the disabled person or them needing something extra. And I totally agree with David. You should never put a disabled person on the spot or put them in the position where they feel pressured to disclose their disability to be included. But do value the disclosure if they choose to share. And I think a very basic thing, David was talking about that meeting earlier and he was around the table. Like a very basic thing is always avoid ableist language. And I think to remember that, accessibility is an antidote to ableism, and it's an important part of equality.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, and I think I've been in the profession not that long, but long enough where I've seen the cycle where there was a big focus on mental health and well-being, especially in the late 2010s, where there was a huge focus on addiction among legal professionals, which is under the disability umbrella. And we've moved now more recently to a lot of firms really focusing on neurodiversity, whatever that means in a particular company and their initiative. And those two things have been on the bookends of, the past decade or whatever in the legal profession. But the legal profession hasn't connected that those things are disability inclusion. And I think, David, you brought up a great point about, physical disability, where they're doing all this work around disability, whether or not they know it, but there's never that explicit intention to make sure that we are being inclusive. And Brandy, you talked about this, accessible to people with physical disabilities. Disability is complex. We already talked about that. But I think it's so interesting how, to use your point, David, the people in the room are focusing on the struggles they're going through with, being neurodivergent or having neurodivergent children or going through the stress and addiction that comes with that. And that's what they focus on rather than being completely inclusive across all disabilities. We have at least 7 minutes left because we have to go to the hour. I was instructed of that. I have one more question for David and Brandy, which we can get short answers, and then I will go to the Q&A because we do have a few questions. So David and Brandy, what is one thing you would like folks to take away from today's session? I know we've talked a lot about a lot of different things, but the one thing you would like people to take away.
Brandy, why don't you go first?
Sure. I think that, not including disabled people in these management positions and leadership, as David was talking about, is a real disservice because and and then also not hiring disabled people in general, because you're losing a whole different perspective of brilliant ideas and ways of looking at the world. If we, as I think AJ had mentioned, it's a problem if you look around the room, or maybe David mentioned, and everybody looks the same. You need diversity to be successful and to have different ideas and different thoughts. And yeah, so I would encourage folks to want to have a diverse team in all aspects, not just disabled people, but in all characteristics.
Yeah, I think I would say the most important takeaway to me is that maybe it's sort of two sides of the same coin. I think folks have to recognize, one, that no matter how good we are as people and how conscious we are of trying to be supportive and trying to build a supportive environment, we necessarily fall short all the time. And where I think we mostly fall short, in my experience at least, is folks with disabilities, whether it's physical, visible or not visible, neurodivergence. I think we're just so far from where we need to be for folks to be able to be successful. And so I would say just being very, very conscious of the little things that you can do that make a much more supportive environment for folks. And then sort of the flip side of that coin, I would say, is recognizing that there is some non-trivial number of people around you who probably work with you every day, whether as lawyers, paralegals, professional staff, who are suffering silently at work because they don't want to be vocal about what they're dealing with and what they're struggling with because they're worried it'll affect their jobs, whether they keep their job, what opportunities they get, what work they get, what advancement they have, or just how people view them, right? There's a concern that if you say I'm struggling with X because I have some sort of disability, again, whether it's physical or otherwise, there's just a worry that someone who you think really respects you, a mentor, right? Someone who's a champion for your career, that may just suddenly affect how they view you, and their support wanes, even if it's on an unconscious level. And so that to me is, I think, the most important takeaway from these discussions is just recognize there are people who are just quietly going about through their day, and they're navigating in ways that they shouldn't have to, that take so much extra energy, so much extra time, makes their lives so much harder, and they're not sharing that with anyone. And just a small little fix from some supportive person, or an environment that tells them it's okay to speak up and ask for help and be who you are, fundamentally changes things for everyone.
Thank you both so much. That leads into a question which I'm going to redirect. But one of the questions was, can a law firm get sued by not forcing a disagreeing client to not discriminate? Put differently, was the firm required to not follow the client misdirection? Brandy, I think that was directed towards you and your story. But I just wanted to use the opportunity because I wanted to say this and forgot. But oftentimes, HR, I think both of you kind of talked about this, views the ADA as adversarial, when if you talk to a lot of disabled workers, if they can get the accommodation without having to go through that formal process and have to get those formal legal protections, which a lot of people need because of discrimination, it's a lot easier on both ends. You both kind of talked about there are really small things you can do to make someone a better, more effective employee without necessarily have to go through the formal legal process. And I think the legal process of getting accommodations is what scares HR, rather than understanding that you can just make accommodations to people's work environment to make it more accessible. But Brandy, I don't know if you wanted to answer that question. It seems like that is for you.
Yeah, I mean, a client can hire whatever attorney they want to hire. So I believe if you can do the job and a firm doesn't hire you because of your disability, then that's a problem, clearly, legally for the firm. But a client, I can't go sue the client because they don't want me to be the attorney representing them. they have like no fiduciary duty to me of any kind or any duty, like, if anything, an attorney has a duty to their client. So there's not going to be like a course of action that you can take on a client not wanting you to represent them. They can, fire and hire whatever attorney they want to.
Thank you. And then we have another question. As a mobility disabled senior paralegal participating in an AM law firm, I'm so glad to hear these conversations among the attorneys and for the openness. Any thoughts on work social opportunities, e.g., walking to a lunch place where a person cannot walk? I think this is actually a great question. I do a lot of work around this. These are kind of like the soft career ladder steps where you are excluded from the golf outing or the happy hour because of stairs, and you miss that opportunity to socialize and make bonds to further your career potentially, if that's something you want. So David, I'll let you go first, and then Brandy, you can wrap us up on that question. But any thoughts on that?
Yeah, again, it gets back to the point I was making earlier. I think we all just have to be really thoughtful about those things. What I will say, that I think one challenge that we have to sort of confront and confess as folks with disabilities is there is sort of a tension, because on the one hand, we say we don't always want to talk about our disabilities and we don't want to have to share a lot about them, but at the same time, we want you to accommodate them. And so that's why I think it's so important to have an environment that is just unequivocally supportive, so that folks know that they can share what they want to share. They don't have to share more. And so if I have a mobility disability and someone invites me to some place that's really going to be difficult for me to walk to, I want to know that I'm in an environment where I can share that. And I don't have to share anything more. I can just say, look, that's going to be difficult for me to get to. And that's the end of it. That's the conversation. And so the two people work together to find some place that's closer. And so on both sides of that, right, I think we've got to be conscious of how we deal with those issues, but it all starts with what's the environment in that office? What's the environment in the business place? Do people feel comfortable having that dialogue? Because without that dialogue, then things get challenging and uncomfortable for everyone. And that's where we have to start.
Yeah, and based on that, David, I think that creating an environment in disability community, sometimes we talk about this of centering the needs of the most marginalized person in that environment. And so, thinking about that in like, who's the like the most disabled person, the fattest person, whatever, like if you can just start off by centering the needs of the most disabled person and basing things on that, like, okay, well then this activity will work for everybody, including the person that's the most marginalized, is like a really important concept in like disability justice movements. And I think it's important for workplaces too. I mean, myself, one of the jobs I've had, they had like what was it? It was, I believe, like a marathon or something that they were running. And obviously I couldn't do that. I cannot run a marathon without like tripping on something or not seeing something. And so yeah, it was difficult. Like I wanted to go, I wanted to be a part of the, team. And as you mentioned, AJ, which also helps to interact with people and to get, those promotions and to show that you're a member of the team. But, I wasn't able to do that. Or I've actually had clients in my pro bono practice that haven't been able to, they want to be on the team, the work soccer team, and there's team shirts, but maybe the team shirts only go up to a 2X and they need a 4X, and so they can show up, but now they're not wearing the team shirt, so they're not showing team spirit, and that also gets in the way of their advancement. So I think like being as accessible to all people is definitely the key.
Thank you so much. We have made it past an hour, so I've officially accomplished my job. I don't know if there are any other questions from the audience, or if Brandy, you or David have any last things you want to share.
I don't think I have any last things to share. Do you, David?
I just would say thank you, certainly to the Beverly Hills Bar Association for organizing this, putting it on. It was their idea. They reached out, and it's fantastic that they're being proactive on this particular topic. And thanks, Brandy, and thanks, AJ, for jumping in to facilitate what I think is a good discussion. So thank you.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you, AJ. Thank you, David. Thank you to the Beverly Hills Bar Association as well. I agree, and I think these topics, and the more people that can have these topics and learn, the better. So thank you.
I want to thank both of you so much. I also want to thank the Beverly Hills Bar Association for hosting. If folks are looking for resources or community, there exists the National Disabled Law Students Association and the National Disabled Legal Professionals Association. If folks are looking for other legal professionals with disabilities or resources or community or things like that, both of those organizations exist and are there for you to reach out to them if need be. And I think we are done. So thank everyone so much for being here, and enjoy the rest of your Mondays and the rest of your weeks.